I love found footage horror movies. They've gotten a bad rap over the years, thanks in no small part to the oversaturation of the market that saw found footage movie after found footage movie coming out. Many of them fundamentally misunderstanding what it is that made found footage movies so effectively creepy. The Blair Witch Project, as a groundbreaking entry into the subgenre, not the very first found footage movie, but certainly the most influential, one could say. That movie had a deliberate cheapness to it, and an improvised nature to it, that made it so credible as a found footage movie. It wasn't full of special effects, it wasn't fully scripted, it was just some actors in the woods being screwed with, and that's what makes it, even today I feel, such an effective film. I watched it just recently and was still creeped out by it. So I was very much looking forward to Blair Witch, the game from Bloober Team, about a bloke wandering the woods looking for a missing child with his dog Bullet. And I've got to say, Bloober Team is a frustrating studio for me. The Layers of Fear games, which it's most predominantly known for, are always on the cusp of being something good, but aren't. There's usually some glaring flaw that undermines the whole attempt at building an atmosphere. Blair Witch, on the other hand, is pretty good, probably their best work. It does some interesting things in terms of gameplay. It takes the Blair Witch property into some new directions without treading all over the Blair Witch Project as a story, like the Blair Witch movie in 2016 bloody did. It's got a real nice atmosphere to it, and it feels like it could legitimately be a Blair Witch game, like it's legitimately taking place in the woods in Burkittsville. So, yeah, I quite like it. It's got some flaws. It's a little bit janky, a little bit cheap and cheerful in places, but I enjoyed it, and I could see myself playing it again. I must say I didn't love it. I was hoping for something a little bit scarier. I didn't find it all that spooky. It's got some really nice tense moments, but it's not got a consistent sense of foreboding and dread. Thanks in some way to the fact that there are monsters that you fight in it, although the combat system is quite interesting. But let's talk about how the game plays out. So, you are Ellis, someone who is searching for a missing child. You're part of a search team. You've joined a sweep of the woods as we look for this boy that may or may not have run away. You're joined by your dog, and a lot of the game is wandering the woods, being, hopefully, from Bloober's perspective, creeped out by what's going on, by all the little noises, some of which are quite effectively recreated from the film. That sound of snapping and stones echoing somewhere in the distance. The sound design is on point here. The dog plays an important part of the game. There's a lot of typical survival horror things, you know, finding levers and doors to pull and finding keys and stuff like that. Mostly wandering around, taking in the sights and the sounds. The dog can be used to look for things. You can ask Bullet to seek around in the environment, might find some collectibles pickups for you. At times, you will find clues that you give to the dog to smell, so the dog can pick up the scent and you follow it as it tracks whatever it is you're looking for. It can also be petted. That's the most important thing in the game. It can be pet. You can treat it with dog snacks, and you're encouraged to treat the dog well, although you can treat it harshly as well. I mean, who would want to do that? What kind of monster would want to do that? But it's one of those games where your actions throughout will dictate how the ending plays out. So be mindful of how you work with the dog and some of the choices you make. Another major component of the game is the camcorder. You find a camera during the course of your adventure, and this is what really impresses me about this game, because it's a Blair Witch game. It's based on the Blair Witch Project, which was a found footage movie which took place, through the lens of a handheld camera. Here, they could have gotten lazy and taken the easy way out and just copied Outlast. And they'd have a good pretense for doing it because it's a Blair Witch game. And they could have said, well, ideologically, we have a right to copy Outlast, because Outlast is obviously inspired in many ways by found footage movies, and we've got the big daddy of found footage movies as the basis for our game. But they didn't do that. No, they were actually creative. The camera is used to, first of all, look at tapes of things that have already been filmed. You'll find tapes, you can look through the lens, and it'll show you things that have happened. If you find red tapes, they have an ability to alter the world around you. Say, for an easy example, you see a closed door. You'll see this in the video footage. You see a closed door, you look on a cassette tape of that area and pause the tape at a point where that door is open, and then in the real world, the door is open. That's a very simple example, and that's basically the kind of stuff you'll be doing with it. It can also be used to see things through the viewfinder that you might not necessarily see with the naked eye, and you don't hold the camera up to do that. You will have the camera recorder screen in the corner, and you'll use that while also looking at the environment at large. This is also used to pretty spooky effect in a few areas of the game, where enemies are more visible through that lens, or the screen rather, it's through the screen, not the lens. And you can't go near them because they will just tear you apart, so you have to look through the screen on the camera in the corner while carefully navigating around to avoid things, and it creates this sense of sort of an inability to correctly gauge the environment, and that can be really creepy without infringing on the player's ability to actually move around. It makes you feel pretty paranoid. The game also has combat, which itself is an interesting implementation. In fact, well, we just saw an example there. Basically, there are spooky little creatures running around the woods, and you shine your light at them to get rid of them. You don't actually fight them in any way. Holly Green from Paste Magazine I was talking to about this, and she described it as like the light mechanic from Alan Wake, except you don't shoot them with a gun, it's just the light. The creatures move very quickly, they're hard to spot, which again can really add to that paranoia. You just see shadows flitting from tree to tree, and you rely on your dog Bullet to give you a sense of where they are. The dog will turn and bark in their direction, so you've got to keep an eye on the dog, who will give you a general idea of where to look, and then you frantically search with the torch to find the creatures and keep them away with the light. It's pretty cool. I actually really like the way that combat system is done. It does kind of undermine some of the tension of the game by the fact that there are spooky monsters in the woods, which part of what makes the first Blair Witch Project, not counting the bloody awful Blair Witch from 2016, part of what made the Blair Witch Project so effective was the fact you did not see what was there, whatever antagonistic force might be there. And I think this could have been done here, because the first time I was in a combat sequence in this game, I could only make out the vaguest silhouettes, even with the light on them. And I just feel like more could have been done graphically to obscure what's there, so you never truly get a sense of what the threat is. Whereas, at certain points in this game, you get a real clear shot of various monsters, and they are just monsters. And that really undermines their effectiveness at times, because once you see them, and they're not really all that creepily designed, so that deflated some of the tension, and that's why I wish the game was scarier. I wish I could see less of the creatures, because once I see it and I'm like, oh yeah, that's just a spooky woods monster, then I'm like, oh, well now I'm not so spooked. But it's still a fun combat system. I would like to see it developed more. I think there's a lot more that could be done with it. Not that I think the Bloober team didn't live up to its potential. I just think there's even more scope for some interesting stuff done with it. I hope it's something that Bloober revisits. Maybe if we get another Blair Witch game, which I would not be against if it was done in this style. Now, like I say, it's a little bit janky, a little bit clunky. The menu system is not fluid. You're holding a button and rotating things on a wheel, but a lot of the options are at weird diagonal points rather than left and right. So there are times when I'm trying to do something with the dog that I didn't want to do, and I just want to pet it, because even though it says pet on the right-hand side of the wheel, you actually got to point diagonally upright. And that threw me for a little bit. Sometimes picking stuff up, interacting with things in the environment requires you to look at it from a specific distance, at a specific angle, even though the interact icon is quite clearly on the screen. It's one of those things where you're like, I'm well within range to pick it up. The game is telling me I can pick it up, but I've got to nudge this way. I've got to nudge this way until the game recognizes that I actually am close enough to interact with something. It's one of those games where it can frequently be irritating when you're like, God, it's there on the floor. I'm right by it, but I've got to nudge just that extra little inch towards it before it'll let me do anything. So that happens quite a bit. The game could have been tightened up in the controls department. But that's really the only major flaw, is just a little bit of jankiness when it comes to interacting with things. Otherwise, I think, yeah, I quite like this game. I'm not in total love with it. I'm not as glowing in my review about it as I would like to be, but I very much did enjoy my time with it. The final act in particular is very cool. Yeah, the final act is really spooky. I went right past the thing I've got to interact with on the tree. That bit was my fault. But yeah, there's a whole final act that takes place in a house, and that's when it really feels Blair Witchy. And also when Bloober is at its most Bloober, because they love messing around with in-game architecture and stuff. So yeah, I'd recommend this if you like the Blair Witch Project and you want a spooky game. I'd say go for it. Also, while I'm here, I'll just do quick impressions of Decay of Logos and Astral Chain. Decay of Logos? Shit. Astral Chain? Pfft, didn't care for it. There you go.